Daily. Solutions. Daily. Podcast. Podcast. The Solution Podcast.
All right, welcome everybody.
Hey there, I'm Graham.
I'm Ashkahn.
And today's question for you is, how often do you both float, and why do you float?
How often do you float, and why do you float?
Both. There's a both in there,
There's
too.
a both and both.
Yep.
How often do you both float? I see.
Together, actually, not that frequently.
Yeah, very, very rarely.
So for me, I guess it fluctuates a lot, but rarely less than, on average, once a week, I'd say, is kind of my regular float schedule.
Yeah, it definitely goes. I do a lot of traveling, so sometimes I'm just in places without float tanks within, a many mile radius of me. So, I've gone even since opening a month without floating or longer from just being out and about in the world. But then in Portland, yeah, once every week to once every 2 weeks, I try to get in something in that range.
Yeah, and we've also just experimented. I mean, as you can imagine, when you own a float tank center, It's really easy to play around with what your kind of ideal level of floating is. And so, we've both gone on floats every single day for stints and gone on floats for, 2 to 3 times a week. And yeah, and then when traveling, I guess it's a little bit harder sometimes to get in tanks. Although sometimes when I'm traveling, I actually float even more than when I'm back at home.
Yeah,
if
definitely.
If you're in a city where you actually want to go check out the different float tank centers, it's pretty appealing to actually go hop in different tanks once every other day or something like that.
And it just is so awesome while traveling. It's especially when you just get off an airplane and you're just kind of super exhausted and all that stuff. Those have been some of my best floats is at the end of a long stint of flying somewhere.
Yeah, for sure. And I will say if I go over a week and certainly over 2 weeks without floating, I really start to notice it. It's like a slow scale addiction withdrawal or something like that. But especially in my backs, I think just doing so much in my backs. I have a single back and that's where I feel not floating. But I think just being hunched over my computer so much of the day and just kind of stationary and doing a lot of sitting at my keyboard really is not necessarily good for my shoulders and my spine and stuff like that. Yeah, sitting is bad for us. So again, for me, it's if I'm out of the tank for longer than a week, it really starts to show up in my muscles.
I think the other interesting thing is that I've gone through different waves of the length of float that I want to do, which is interesting. I started, I started doing the 90s when we first started up, and then for a while after that, I kept just wanting to float longer and longer and longer. It was a point where I was doing 2.5 hours floats were kind of the norm, and then started doing some 3.5 and middle of the night long ones, 4.5, 5 hour floats. And then for me, it actually started fluctuating beyond that. Right now, I've been really digging 60-minute floats. Actually, I'll hop in and I'll feel really good after 60 minutes, and my almost consistently for the last few months will very much detect that 60-minute point and feel like I had a nice hearty float. So I don't know. It's interesting how it goes through these kind of big waves like that.
Yeah, it definitely does. When I don't time myself, I find I often get out between about 2 and 3.5 hours.
Uh-huh.
That's kind of my body's natural instinctive time to wind up the float. And then you can push past that too and kind of go back into the zone and stay in for longer as well. But and that for me is pretty consistent. If I don't turn on any music or anything like that, that's been how it goes. I guess 90 minutes is what I've been doing recently, though. I guess I'm an early morning riser, and we only do long floats late at night now, so that's probably been a factor. And I'm trying to think of what other useful information about frequency of floats. So for me, even floating every day for a while, and then switching to floating 3 times a week, twice a week, I think around 2 to 3 times a week is kind of the sweet spot in Graham floating maintenance. In that I didn't really notice that I felt too much different when I was floating every single day versus floating about 3 times a week. And I'm not sure if it's because personally I have that 2 to 3 day post-float afterglow. I know that time period after a float kind of differs for everyone where they still feel really floaty. But at about 3 times a week, kind of just constantly riding that wave of floating after you get out of the tank. And again, for me, that's a sweet spot. If I'm getting in 2 to 3 times a week, I feel really happy and kind of on point.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like for me more recently, the actual like time in the float tank has been the thing that's been kind of the most impactful. And I don't tend to notice like huge differences in days afterwards or stuff like that. Like it's the kind of like in tank experience.
So there you have it. Who knew floating is actually different for every single person and between floats?
Yeah.
And then, so why do you float, Ashkahn?
Why do I float?
Because it wouldn't be embarrassing if we didn't.
It's interesting. I really get very poor visuals.
Like you mean your visuals just kind of like low bit?
Yeah, grainy.
Yeah, black and white.
I've honestly barely ever seen like anything in there other than like one time I saw purple for a brief moment and I got like super excited that I was seeing something and then I lost it.
Yeah, you can't force that.
You can't force it. Yeah, clearly. So I don't like that part is not something that I've noticed too severely. I've never really had a lot of issues with stress or feeling kind of huge impacts of stress
Or sleeps.
or yeah, problems sleeping. So like none of that stuff has I felt been kind of super impactful from. Like I haven't noticed huge differences in floating for my sleep or for my stress levels. But what I really appreciate from it is I do find that it's an amazing place to think. Like I've noticed that I don't naturally give a lot of like time and attention to just kind of like solid introspection and really thinking through things. And I've had some great ideas in the float tanks and I've realized things about my life. And sometimes they're extremely mundane. Like it's just like, oh, that's how I should answer that email. Or like
I could eat peanut butter 3 times as efficiently. I've been a fool.
triple spoon. Like, so, you know, sometimes it's just a little work problem. Sometimes it's something with, you know, my personal life and my relationships with other people. And I find that just kind of being in there and decluttering the day-to-day stuff my brain is thinking about gives me a chance to really actually like realize the things I maybe should be spending more time thinking about. And I found that to be really beneficial. I really like kind of having those floats. And as a result, my favorite time to float is like in the middle of the afternoon and my body's like the most alert and the most ready to go. So I'm not like floating to relax or ease into my night or anything. I'm literally floating when like my mind is kind of working at its kind of peak of the day. And even despite that, having kind of more active floats that aren't as focused on kind of relaxation or anything, I still come out and almost no matter what, even if while I was in the float tank I didn't really think of much or whatever, I have this very like, it's almost like satiated feeling, you know, like I feel like every time I come out of float, no matter what, even if while I was in there, like it didn't feel like I was really hitting the space I wanted to hit or anything, I come out and it's just like, there's kind of like a post float that happens regardless every time I float. So
were you done? Thought you were gonna keep going there. I would have jumped in. Yeah, I guess for me what I get out of floating differs a lot, but the why I float stays broadly consistent, which is I float because I feel better and kind of more like my ideal self or something when I'm actually hopping in the tank regularly. And that's physical. Like I mentioned, I have really bad posture when I'm working on the computer too. Like I get really into my emails and like hunch over and get closer to them. So I feel like I'm, you know, kind of
yell
like,
right into the
computer.
computer.
You just yell at the computer. So it's really not good for my posture. So definitely I'd say the first 20, 25 minutes of a float, regardless of how long I'm in the tank, I really spend kind of stretching out and doing yoga in the float tank kind of, and just really actually often on my hips and shoulders focusing. So that alone is really great. And I've still been trying to figure out, because as you can imagine, running a float tank center, you get this question a lot, right? When you're running your float center, I'm sure that there are customers coming in asking you how often you float and why you float all the time. And I have trouble explaining exactly like these more subtle effects that I get from floating. But the way that I usually say it is, like, I notice if it's been a long time since floating and then I float, that it brings me back to this state that I'm really used to being in. So if it has been like 2 weeks since I've hopped in a tank, which I guess for me is kind of a long time, and then I hop in, I immediately remember what it's like to be a little more Gramly or like a little more just like my best self or something. Like my thoughts are more focused. I have an easier time just actually getting done, powering through sometimes challenging work that I need to do. Even interactions with other people, I feel like I'm just less stressed out and able to like kind of wave away any irritation or something like that I might be feeling towards like an incident or a person. And it just, again, it kind of like makes me the best version of myself. But it's such a subtle and slow acting return back to like slightly worse posture, slightly more stressed out, slightly more irritable Graham. And like Ashkahn too. It's not like I'm a very irritable person to begin with. So maybe that's why it's such a subtle transition. But yeah, it's so much so that I don't notice it happening when I'm not floating. It's only after I've gone through a period of it and then floated that I realize kind of like how much I'd slid backwards into all these bad habits almost.
Sometimes I feel like it pushes me too far into just not caring about things. Like, I'll come out of a float and I'll have like a meeting and I'm supposed to be like, upset at someone for not getting something done. I'm just like, yeah, it's fine. It doesn't matter. None of it does. Don't even worry about it. Like it makes me care a little bit too less about everything.
A little bit too less, huh? Yeah. It's hard because I feel that way anyway. Normally, staying angry at people is really challenging. You really have to work for it,
So, yeah.
And I also, although I've had, I think, more visuals and maybe some more trippy experiences in the tank than Ashkahn, I think I'm also very much on that low scale of actually having auditory or visual hallucinations or even kind of more of those deep spiritual sort of experiences. So similarly, it's a great place for rest and relaxation, a great place for thinking. And yeah, I love that kind of residual, peaceful Graham sort of vibe that it gives me afterwards, but also kind of personally, at least, not going in for the more psychedelic side of it.
Yeah, maybe one day it'd be cool to get crazy. Sometimes I'm jealous of our customers.
Oh, yeah.
They come out and they're like, yeah, just gorillas riding surfboards in there. And I was like, what?
I'm jealous of Jake Marty. All right. Well, if you have any more business or personal questions to send our way, go to floattanksolutions.com/podcast and shoot them on over.
We'll talk to you tomorrow.
Bye, everyone.